Today is May 13th, 2020, and I am doing basically commentary on Religion Explained, the evolutionary origins of religious thought. We are in Chapter 3, and Chapter 3 is the kind of mind it takes. And basically what he's going to do in this chapter is sort of change our view of what the mind actually does and how it does it. He gave us a story that I read yesterday about a dog and a man leaving the back of a house and then a dog seeing a cat and knocking the man over and his hat falling off, and a police woman seeing that, trying to catch him to give him his hat, and all of that. And he mentions 6 inference systems that were engaged: understanding the physics of solid objects, understanding physical causation, detecting goal-directed motion, keeping track of who's who, linking structure to function, and understanding mental representation. So he goes on. This is not by far the complete list of the inference systems that were used. But then he goes on to say, he talks about intuitive physics. In other words, the inference system that tells us about solid objects is intuitive physics. That we have precise expectations is not something that we are aware of. We do it unconsciously. Our mind provides us with inferences from, as we are watching what is happening, the dog running for the cat, we say to ourselves, or we imply that we know that he's going after the cat, that the goal of the dog at that point is to get the cat. The thing is, intuitive physics uses observable phenomena like the motion of objects to enter what is intrinsically invisible. This is one thing that inference systems do. They give us some idea of things that aren't there. So, for instance, when we're thinking about what's going on in somebody else's head, if you remember the chimpanzee who knows that the alpha male is supposed to receive good food when the chimpanzee comes upon it, but the chimpanzee decides to keep it for himself and eat it rather than turn it over to the alpha male. That's it. The chimpanzee knows that he's not supposed to do that, but he does it anyway. That's in psychology, that's called a theory of mind, but it's also something that's invisible. It's the authority relationship between the alpha male and the chimp who's found the food. That is an invisible relationship. It doesn't really exist except in the heads of both chimpanzees. Now, he has presented ontological categories, that is, like animal or plant or person. He's presented these as pretty solidified kinds of presentations, but that's not actually the way they are. All over the mind, there are these little specialists, like all of the specialized downstairs people in the estate in England in the 20s, anyway, Downton Abbey time. You have all these downstairs people who have very specialized functions, and they are to do those functions and those functions only. And the mind has that too, but it turns out we do not store encyclopedic information. We don't have a catalog of all the things we've ever seen. We are bombarded all of the time with all kinds of sensory data, but that data is sort of spontaneously taken care of through our inference systems. So underneath the ontological categories are all these little inference systems, and they get connected to each other in different ways. So, for instance, we can take a person or a dog, and we can attribute to a person, or human, or a dog, a goal orientation. The dog was going after the cat. That was the dog's goal. The person was going after the money or whatever. The person was going after all of that. He had, the old man had all the rings and jewelry in his pocket. He was stealing. It was his goal. Well, we apply goal to two different categorical ontological categories. Ontology, again, means just being, category of being. But the mind puts it together in different ways, and it does it more or less unconsciously without us really even knowing what's happening. So there are all kinds of different things. We have an intuitive physics, which is knowing that something is solid and inanimate, or you could see two billiard balls, one hit the other, and we can see cause and effect. But cause and effect is invisible. We put upon those two objects the cause and effect inference, but it's invisible. It's an illusion. There's intuitive psychology. There's structural function. The structure of a screwdriver, the screwdriver in the story, was that is a functional structure. We know that the screwdrivers are used to put screws into something, and so there's the head of the screwdriver goes into the head of the screw, and then it can be turned, and that's a function, and that is an inference. We infer the function from the object. Okay, so all this is to show that you can replace what I call ontological categories with theories with a list of appropriate inference systems. So below the level of ontological categories are the inferences, and the inferences can be used in different categories at times as necessary. So, for instance, that goal-oriented idea, the inference of a goal having been set and established, that's down below the level of ontological category. Instead of having a complex mental encyclopedia with theoretical declarations about what animals and artifacts and persons are, all we have are flags which switch on in particular systems and turn off in other systems. So we have a whole bunch of things about animal, those inferences, but that is a smorgasbord of inferences that can change with the particular animal. We don't remember the concept. We don't have a list of all of the concepts. We are not encyclopedic. We are inferential. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, that we know this now. There are actually 4 different groups involved. There was an experimental group with normal adults, which really showed us how some of these inference systems work with normal people. And then so causation is one among many examples of such principles. So these principles of inference were figured out, at least in one sense, with normal people. And then cognitive development has shown that with much more precision than before, how some of these principles appear very early in infancy. So these are sort of innate to how the mind works and comes up in infancy, and how they make it possible to acquire vast amounts of knowledge so quickly. It's a much more facile system, a much more easy system than if we had to keep and memorize every single thing. Every single thing is a polyglot of inferences, and those inferences are all tacked together in a particular way. So when we think aardvark, the inferences that apply to an aardvark come up with the ontological category of animal, but the inferences are interesting. Okay, so there are four groups: the cognitive development people, the experimental people on normal adults, the fMRI, the use of MRIs to look at what happens when the brain fires. And they found very specific little locations in the brain that are fired when various things are run by the person who is having the MRI. And then finally, neuropsychologists have discovered cognitive pathologies that impair some inference systems while leaving the rest intact. So people without a particular inference system give a clear idea of, and this is an old scientific technique. I can't remember the guy's name, but there was a guy in the 19th century who was setting charges, and in the charges for the railroad, he was working for the railroad, and they were putting in blasting, whatever, and blasted through his through the front of his brain, through the through the cortex in the front. One of these metal spikes went right through it, and he, who had been a sort of happy-go-lucky, easygoing guy, turned out to be kind of belligerent afterward. And so a doctor did rather close examination of this fellow over a number of years, and he was able to identify the parts that this fellow was now missing because part of his brain had disappeared in the explosion. Well, that kind of pathological experience, people who are missing certain inference systems, has helped in this process. So he says the next section he calls wheels within wheels, and he's talking about the real complexity of the brain. The fact that very specialized systems are selectively turned on or off when we consider different kinds of objects. In other words, we are always being bombarded by a lot of data, and the brain selects that data through inference and turns on or off parts of the inference system that it needs for that particular stimuli, whatever it may be. Inference systems are activated by several different kinds of objects. So you can use sometimes the same inference system for a person or an animal or even an inanimate object sometimes. Objects migrate from one of these so-called categories to another. So, for instance, and he uses the example of fish. Fish as an animal swimming and then is caught and is filleted and cooked, it becomes an inanimate object. But we don't have to think about that because our inference systems work out that we've gone from an animal to an inanimate object. And we do that subconsciously. It is, of course, not the object itself that has changed, but the kinds of inferences the mind produces about it. So at some point, the fish becomes, the cooked fish becomes an artifact rather than an animal. Or if you took the fish and you hit somebody with it, that would be fish as tool. So the inference would be quite different. The description of our minds as a bundle of inference systems differently activated by different objects is better than the mental encyclopedia because it is much closer to the way a brain actually is organized. So we do not have an internal catalog that has put in all of the, Sherlock Holmes's memory palace. To the contrary, because that's the way he claimed to have remembered things in his encyclopedic memory. That isn't the way we actually do it. All of this has been, as I say, of the four groups, the experimental group, the cognitive group, the MRI group, and the pathological group studying pathologies, have all developed a picture of the inference systems of the mind. And so this idea of categorical, ontological categories is actually a lot more complicated than we think, because it depends on what inference systems are triggered in our mind. But more of that later. Anyway, take care of yourself.